Podcast is one of the fastest growing digital content formats in the world. Turkey is experiencing an enormous increase in the numbers of podcasts produced. Certainly, journalists are among those who benefit from most this rise. Today I have Mohamed El Abed with me. He is a co-founder and executive producer at Soundtelling in Sweden. Mohamed is the instructor alongside with Sofia, whom I got my first podcast training. He has several successful podcasts, but I don't know what he has been up to these days. So I will ask Mohamed to tell us about Soundtelling and what he has been working on recently. Welcome, Mohamed. How are you?
Thank you. Hi. I'm doing well. It is summer. It's hot in Stockholm, Sweden. Not as hot as I think is in Istanbul.
It is really hot in here, but I think, okay, we are managing.
Yeah, I closed all the windows to get the best possible sound as possible, but it's going to be hot, so it's going to be here. So I'm doing fine, fine. So you want me to tell you a little bit about Soundtelling and what I've been doing since last time we saw each other in December?
Yes, please, if it's possible.
Yeah, so Soundtelling is an audio media company, pretty much is a podcast company, and we work with three legs. So one of our where we get our main income from the beginning and has been our stable income has been doing branded podcasts, which we work with storytelling with brands, like brands, NGOs, organizations, and it can be a advertising campaign, more like an advertising agency where we work. So we work with IKEA, we work with Sneaker Stuff, which is a big e-commercial sneaker brand in Sweden, a sneaker store. We work with telephone companies, so we do different commercials for them pretty much, and we use podcasts as audio. And the second leg that we also doing more and more now is we're doing our own originals. We have been doing like a true crime podcast that we have been doing from the beginning. We've been working with a therapy podcast. Love for Real is the name of the podcast. And pretty much it's a podcast where a therapist talk with people that are single and also with couples and meet them and talk about love, how to sustain love or how to get a race with yourself and find love. And then we do a podcast with called Your Self-Help. Which is two comedians who try different self-help methods every week. So that's pretty much, we're more and more gaining traction in that area. And then we have the third leg, which is more like, how can we start in audio? A lot of our ideas start with audio. Then we today in the landscape say, okay, can this become a TV series? Can it become a movie? Can it become a book? Can it become a theater play? We are, one of the first projects that we're doing is doing a true crime television series for HBO Nordic that will be televised probably in December this year. So it's a more true crime. Is a cult and a murder, all the ingredients in a true crime thing that people love. So that's pretty much what we do. And then we do workshops. Like I do a lot of lectures and do since a part of my work is working with what's happening in the podcast section, because the podcast section is moving so fast. It's a beautiful tool, but it's also a young tool. You see what's shifting, what's happening. Spotify is a big player. Spotify has just been a player at the podcast industry for only 2 years. And they have been doing a lot of major acquisitions lately. So it's been helpful. So I'm looking around. So I'm talking about what is happening in the podcast, but also the way how we met when I did a collaboration with News Lab Turkey and the Swedish Institute and Guardian Foundation, where I basically do podcast workshop. And more I'm looking how you can do podcasts with your smartphone. So I do that kind of different podcasts. I did podcast workshop. I do it for people that are professional journalists, but I also do it for media people, but I also do it for kids. Yeah. And the kids one are real life. So I do podcast workshop 1.0, 2.0. So basically that's Soundtelling, and Soundtelling is a medium small agency, and we are 12, 13 employees now. Pretty much what I've been doing since we last saw each other has been Corona. It's a lot of Corona. But luckily, compared to other people in the industry of communication, podcast and audio has been one of the more fortunate ones when it comes to Corona, because of the digital development has gone so fast. So we are able to, today, you and me speaking on a Zoom call and doing a podcast. And maybe if we're lucky, the sound will sound like we were in the studio next to each other.
Hopefully, we did our best.
Hopefully. So that's been so I've been working with that. And then we also having a podcast where it's through Corona. So I'm producing a podcast called This Moment, which is a podcast in English. is a chef called Marcus Samuelsson, a Swedish Ethiopian guy who lives in New York, has a famous restaurant called Red Rooster in Harlem. He's a famous figure in New York, public figure. So he's doing a podcast with famous Swedish rapper called Jason Deakte, Timbuktu. So they doing a podcast called This Moment, where they're covering like what is Black identity. So that's a podcast that we are recording from like Stockholm, New York. And so that's what I've been working about mostly. And then like, running a company.
Yeah. Can you tell me, when did you establish Soundtelling? And could you imagine back then that this is gonna be the new thing, like the rising medium about the podcasts?
So Soundtelling is almost 4 years old. We'll be coming up this fall. So when we started Soundtelling, we saw that people were thinking as production companies, and nobody, especially in Sweden where I'm based, was thinking that, okay, how can we start an audio media company that can be more than just a production company? So when we started Soundtelling, we were the first company that worked with audio that looked at podcasts as more than just a traditional way of doing radio. We looked at it more like, okay, can this be a commercial? How can we work with that? And that was how we saw it from the beginning. And then more and more, as the industry developed, we didn't see like that. We see more and more today that your podcast can become a television series, which the United States has kind of been the front runners in.
Okay, let's start from the zero. Even though I know the answer to this question, I want our listeners to hear it from you. Can someone start a podcast for free? How much or what it takes to start a podcast?
Basically today, what it takes to start a podcast is pretty much just your smartphone. And all you have to do is hold your smartphone, record 5 centimeters from your face, and you can do a podcast with your smartphone. And you can use an app which is free called Anchor. So pretty much that's all you need to start a podcast. It won't be like high quality. You won't be able to do the finesse and different things, but that's all you need pretty much and to start a podcast. And also, of course, you need to know why I'm doing this.
Yeah, exactly.
But otherwise, that's all you need.
Okay.
And some headphones. Of course.
Yes. Okay, what are the things we need to consider if we want to able to make money from our podcast? I think this question that you said, you need to know what you want to do, is coming in here. So how to make money from our podcast?
So you pretty much have to monetize your audience. What kind of audience do you have? So if you have a podcast that only have 100 subscribers or 100 listeners, it's not an audience what I can think like of a big podcast like your podcast, which have like 5,000, have a lot of 1,000 listeners. And that's a big podcast. You have a pretty clear concept, which is unique. So what you need is to know your audience. So if you have a dental podcast and you have 500 dentals in Turkey where listen to your podcast, that's a pretty strong market for people to sell products to dental specialists. So that's all you need. You need to know your audience. You need to know your niche to be able to find a brand that you can work with, a brand or a company or a collaboration.
What kind of trends that you see in journalism, like the podcasts who make money in journalism? What kind of news programs they are producing in podcast format?
So pretty much the biggest news podcast in the world for the moment is The Daily, which is produced by the New York Times. You can call it The Daily a branded podcast because it's in a way they are making the brand New York Times so much stronger. And pretty much they're using their top journalists, talk about specific topics, that make them tell them, okay, what you're working more. If you're working with Beirut for the moment, tell us what's happening in Beirut. Give us audience. Like in audio, you can do so much more than you can do in text. Like in audio, I was listening to this Beirut episode the other day, and the journalist can tell like, okay, I got hit. So she told me as a listener how she was trying to get to the hospital. And pretty much that in that sense, she told me how much chaos it was. So when it comes to news journalists, you have a lot of newspapers that are seeing podcasts as not an outlet. Because a lot of newspapers are, every day that go, they are missing subscribers. The subscribers base are getting less and less because people don't read the newspaper in the same way. And so you see more and more, like New York Times, I think The Daily is one of their more profitable machines. Yeah. And then again, everybody can't be New York Times. So, but I see more and more those journalists that do their work with Patreon. They are, I don't know how truthful they are, But you see more and more trends that you have dependent journalists who are getting Patreon, getting money by Patreon, and they are using podcasts.
Our second episode was specifically about Patreon because since it's a sustainable format that you can get monthly income from it, it had its own episode in the series. And I also see, or should I say hear, this trend in podcasts or also in journalism in general. There are like slow news stories that we hear and read. That's also, I think, one of the rising format. So, like you said that not everybody is New York Times. So, can we assume that it will take some time to start making money from a podcast if one is not coming with an already established audience? When is the best time to think of monetizing, making money from a podcast, especially if we had started from the scratch, from zero? How can we know that our audience is ready to support our podcast financially?
So what you need to think is like podcast is a totally new medium, a way of communicate. So it will take time. We still have a lot to learn. Like it's something new happening every week, every day. So you need to have a clear idea. What do I want to do this? Why do I want to do this? You have to think that it's funny, and you have to be consistent. That's one of the most important things. And as always, even if you are a journalist, you pretty much all your first episodes will suck. This rarely won't be the best episodes. Like after you've done a couple, you barely want to go back and listen to your episodes because it's like everything else. You have to have your 10,000 hours to become really good at something, and you have to have a plan. Like, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to make money. Oh, this is going to be my livelihood, or part of my livelihood. Then I have to, invest time. So you have to make a plan. Okay, I'm going to do this for real for at least a year. That's the sad part. People think that is just to record, send out an episodes, and the audience will find you. And then you're on the wrong track. Yeah. So you have to have a plan for a year. Like do that plan and then go back to your plan. Update your plan after 2-3 episodes, because then you understand, okay, probably would take me like 40 hours to make an episode. In the beginning, since you're learning, you are putting in so much time. Yeah. And then when you become real good at it, you're also putting in so much time because you want to, when you tweak it, you want to make some finesse, you want to make the extra sound, you want to walk that extra walk. So when it comes to monetizing, you have to have patience. And then, of course, like after a while, you can see, okay, I can see that my audience like this kind of episodes.
Do you have a number in your mind? Like if you have this much of listener for each episode in average, then maybe you can start searching for sponsorships. Do you have like any number in your mind, more or less?
No, I'm like, you can start like 3,000-4,000. I don't know about the Turkish market. But the next step, how to get sponsors, is also, having a network. Yeah. So that's pretty much because you have to learn people. You cannot call them because probably in Turkey, like I don't remember what was the first years in Sweden, it's like companies would like, what is podcast? Yeah. It's not that rare that it still happen, but people was like, so you have to have a network also. Yeah. I'm sad. Like in the beginning, a lot of people doesn't know what podcast is. You have to know people. Yeah. So you know people as a person, or you team up with people that know people.
Yeah. I remember one of the journalists who was in our training program, Nazan. I read it yesterday. She wrote, when I started to do podcasts, I was explaining what podcast is to my interviewees. Yeah. So after they were giving me interviews, I had to explain what podcast is first. And same thing is valid for the companies as well, yes.
Like the first 2 years of Soundtelling, we were like, it was like, I felt like I was an educator.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, in terms of news industry, how can we choose the method of podcast monetization if we want to create a sustainable income? Maybe you can answer this question in 2 parts, like for news organizations and for freelance journalists.
Okay, so first I have to say, like, the main reason why podcast is winning is because it's one of the few things that you can do something simultaneous. That's why people love podcasts in the first, because they can be educated. They can be entertained while they're doing the dishes, while they're out running, while they're going to the supermarket, while they're taking a walk. And they also get subjects to talk with over dinner or with their friends. That's why I'm starting by saying this, is because the news organization, they are losing subscribers for the newspapers. They have to, if they want to survive, they have to see that maybe podcasts can be our first income in the future instead of the newspaper. And then you have to switch over, and then you have to go all in podcasts. I see that many news organizations here in Sweden, they do podcasts with their left hand. And they also get results after that. Their heart is always for the newspaper. That's always why the result is pretty bad. And you can see that, like, that's why the Daily is such a good example, because they went all in.
Yeah.
They went 150% into the product. So that's like invest and probably see like podcast is here to say, and this is the future. So that was for the news organizations. And as a freelance journalist, you have to see, okay, how can I make money on more platforms for one story? So you can use your podcast. If you go away, find a story or do an interview, you can use it by writing, and you can use it if you get the audio. If you know how to do audio, you can also resell it as an audio story. So that's more as you have to see. I see the future for freelance journalists is sad to say. You have to be like a Swiss Army knife. Probably like the next generation of future freelance journalists, they probably will be able to know how to like write, do an audio story, edit, and do it also, but they probably also know how to do a film.
Yeah. I think it's already shifting in that direction. That's for sure. And also, you need to also specialize in terms of topics.
Yeah.
What about joining a podcast network? If you have an already established audience as a journalist, maybe you can start working in podcast network. Do you have examples like that in Sweden?
The thing with the podcast network is if you have a good brilliant idea, you can pretty much go into a podcast network if you have them, and they would help promote it, your idea, your podcast through other podcasts. So if you already have a successful podcast, your way only reason why you might want to join a podcast network is to get help. Because are you working too much? But if you want to, if there are a couple of podcast networks in Turkey that they can work with, I highly recommend that, because podcast network, we did a podcast called Showcase Secrets together with Radiotopia in the United States. And at that time, this was 2 years ago, Radiotopia had more than like 18-20 million listeners in their podcast network. So we got a huge promotion by doing this collaboration with Radiotopia. So we got a lot of listeners in the United States, which we would never be able to have if we just made the podcast, released it in English in the American market.
What do you think about premium content? Like, is it a good way to make money from your podcast in news industry? Because it's come with some questions, I think.
Probably, I don't know. I think that's pretty hard to do in the news industry, but you see more. We have a successful organization called Podme in Sweden. They are having their podcast behind paywalls, and it's going really good. The thing is, you don't have to have that many subscribers if you have premium content. Like if you have a cost like $10 a month or something like that. Maybe like if you have 8,000 subscribers, that's pretty much money.
Yeah.
And people also forget that Spotify is a premium service mostly.
Exactly, yeah.
If you don't prefer the commercial.
Okay, since we are talking about sustainability, we need to consider some details. Let's say that we started to make some money from our podcast. How much money we should consider to spare from that income to spend on developing our production, buying some new equipments and stuff? What costs we need to consider to develop and sustain our podcast?
Don't be dumb cheap. Like I call it that in Swedish. And so, everything that that you can like, I don't need to do this. This is still my time which time that I can put in the project. So you have to develop, okay, maybe if I'm not that good a copywriter, maybe you hire somebody to do the text for you, for example. Because you see, you sit down a lot of time with the copy text, so that is one reason. And then also you like pretty much starting a podcast is like starting a company, and like a company, if you want your company to grow, you pretty much have to invest all the money in the beginning. So what we did with our company, we didn't have that much we didn't take out that much money in the beginning. The first 2 years, barely made any money. It was really hard to make the good ends. And it still is at some times. But at the same time, now we are so many employees, so you starting to see the fruits of all the hard labor and the sacrifices you have done. So basically, you should see your podcast as a media company.
Yeah.
Even if you're doing one podcast, you should see it as a media company. Do you hire a market person? Do you have a salesperson?
What is the most sustainable way to create income from podcasts, you think?
Consistent. Having an idea, being out there, building an audience, talking to your audience, getting your audience involved. Now it's pretty hard of Corona, but going out, doing stage performance with your audience, being a fan, being a cult around your podcast is the most which I can see here in Sweden. The most successful podcast is when they use a lot of more platforms, and then also being guests in different podcasts.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, can you give us some successful examples of news organizations and freelance journalists from the globe and maybe from Sweden that make sustainable income from podcasting? We said, of course, the Daily. And can you tell us also what are their methods of monetizing? Also, maybe you can tell us their strengths and weaknesses that you observed.
So the Daily is pretty easy. They have the best journalists in the world, and they make them journalists to tell something that is really complicated as they tell you as you were 4 years old. So that's what they have done pretty much. In Sweden, we could see there was a huge bump for a podcast called Aftonbladet, the Daily. They do a podcast 5 minutes, pretty much what's the top subjects for the day. And they got a huge bump during the Corona because people want to know about the news. Basically, the first couple of weeks, you saw a big bump of news podcasts in Corona. And then also always election podcasts is really popular because people want to know. They want to know what their people they are voting for are saying and what's happening prior to election. And so you can see that. Yeah, see, news organization that has strong brands has been able to get a good podcast like The Guardian. And you say Polite, which is a Danish newspaper, and they pretty much done true crime podcasts. Also, you have those example of Swedish newspapers that had done a more journalistic true crime podcast series connected to the newspaper. It's an outlet thing. I think those has been more as successful in Scandinavia. Okay. And then as a freelancers, I see those kind of Patreon journalists. That you can have your thoughts and debates of what they are saying. Especially in Sweden, you see a lot of those Patreon journalists. There are they get Patreon because they say they use in a kind of rhetoric you're not able to say anything in Sweden anymore, and that's why I started this podcast as a platform for people to come on, and then it could be real almost some of them being racist guests, being able to have their thoughts. They get a lot of support, economic support from people that are supporting them because they have those thoughts and they are kind of scared to be open about those thoughts because they probably lose friends and family because they would think they pretty much are racist. I don't know if that's a sad example, but we have a couple of those people that are supporting. In Sweden, we see a lot of this is out of your question, but there's a lot of comedians getting money from Patreon. Yeah. Some of them are doing morning shows and get Patreon subscribers. So those are the most successful.
Yeah, but what about the news organizations? How do they make money from their podcasts?
Advertising
and sponsorships.
Yeah, sponsorship, but they don't say the sponsorship because they have to be newsworthy. So they have ads, radio ads.
What are the types of ads you see mostly in journalism? Is it native advertising or in the beginning and at the end jingle playing?
It's totally different. You have those in the beginning, in the middle, and some have it in the end. And pretty much everybody knows that they don't listen to the end. So they try to have it in the beginning and in the middle. So what I recommend is you do a talk for 5 minutes, talk about something funny for 5 minutes, and then you have the first ad.
Yeah, okay.
Or you talk, or you do an intro about the guest, and then you have the ad before the guest and your conversation comes on, and then you have it in the middle one.
Okay, thank you for the tips and tricks. I will go to the next question then. We know that news is not cheap and journalists need to make living, of course. However, when it comes to the news, it comes with the issue of social responsibility and ethics. On the other hand, people are not so willing to pay for the news, even though it's changing in a positive direction that we see from the reports of Reuters, recent reports on digital news. The question is, how can a journalist or news organization find ways of making income from podcasts without going against journalism values? How can journalists or a news organization balance this thing?
Having anonymous ads. They don't have to say the ads, the news journalists. You can have other people saying the ads. You already had it. You have it in the newspaper. As soon as you open the newspaper, you have plenty of ads.
Yeah.
It's the same thing.
What are your suggestions, tips and tricks? We need more tips and tricks for the journalism industry.
I think I've been very generous for the Turkish journalist corps. I don't know how much I can. I'm feeling like a Santa Claus.
Okay, do you have any other tips and tricks for making sustainable income for like journalists, news institutions, freelance journalists?
In a way, it's kind of a sad but pretty much exciting time for journalists because they are going through a renovation.
Yeah.
And it's not as easy as it was when they were on the outlet. There's so much information to take in. But what you have to see that this is, instead of being angry and bitter about it, you have to see it as an exciting time, and you have to see it as a possibility to learn and have fun. We are at the moment that we are seeing so many stories. It's so much information to take in, but it's also a revolution where you have new people that want to tell stories, but they haven't gone to school to tell stories, and they are making the way or new ways on how to tell stories. Yeah. And you have those new voices. Okay, you have a lot of fake news, a lot of racists being out there. But at the same time, you have people telling the news, telling the stories that were not able to tell stories before. Mm-hmm. You give news angles in a different way. We wouldn't have a George Floyd. Mm-hmm. We wouldn't have, like, if this would be in the 90s and what happened in Beirut, wouldn't have gained that much traction all over the world. It's not ending. It's like people are being reminded. So you have to see that even if sometimes it's hard and painful and it's going real fast, you also have to see that you are in a revolutionary period of life. Mm-hmm. And like see what is happening and see, and you can say like this is not journalist's way of telling a story like you are used to it, but is it also a way of development as we as human beings? Mm-hmm. So my tips is like, have fun when you do your podcast, see the possibility to meet new people. See the way for you to tell different stories. See the way to learn. And see the way to talk to your audience. You can build an audience in a way you wouldn't be able to do writing news articles, for instance. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Mohamed. I asked my questions. That was it. Do you have anything to add, ask, or say?
No, I'm just impressed with the development of the Turkish podcast market, and it has so much similarities, like the Swedish wave that we had in the beginning for like 9 years ago. But it's like this couple of years, the first years is going to be so many people discovering podcasts in Turkey. Like I feel sometimes that we have hit like the roof in Sweden. And you are in the beginning. It's going to be so fun because I know your podcast is going to be like next time I will be doing the interview with one of Turkey's biggest podcast stars, and doing the interview with you. So I'm going to one who's going to be amused and be very entertained and be glad that you were able to have time for me to even talk to me.
I will always have time for you.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I'm glad I have that on the record.
Yeah. Okay, then thank you for listening. Till next episode, take good care of yourself.